Thank you very much. So I've last slot, and I'd like to turn to the topic of mitigation. Next slide. At the time that the Paris Agreement was signed, it wasn't immediately clear whether or not one of its main goals, that goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, was in fact technologically feasible. This wasn't really a question that had been interrogated in great detail by the scientific community, certainly not by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change prior to 2015. But importantly, in 2017, next slide please, it became clear that this was indeed a feasible target. Studies started to come out that demonstrated technologically feasible mitigation pathways in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees in the long term. The next slide. But when you look at what these pathways look like, this is a figure from a more recent IPCC report. What you see is that we're left with a great deal of options. There are pathways in which emissions stay roughly at current levels until the early 2030s and then are rapidly reduced. But in that period of time, we overshoot 1.5 degrees and leave ourselves with the need to take large amounts of carbon back out of the atmosphere subsequently. There are pathways in which emissions are cut very, very rapidly this decade by much more than 50%. And we don't leave ourselves with the legacy of substantial carbon dioxide removal needs. Next slide. And this range of pathways in the years to come creates substantial policy and legal uncertainty. How fast the world as a whole needs to cut its emissions, even before we get to the thorny question of how to distribute those emission reduction pathways between different states, is a question that reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does not explicitly answer. It gives a lot of options. But these pathways are not all the same. They represent different choices about the future, different acceptance of risk, different consequences for humanity. Next slide. So what is the cause of this difference? Well, the main reason why you have this wide range of pathways consistent with the long-term temperature goal is because of the differential dependence on our ability to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere across these different pathways. Carbon dioxide removal can be used to counterbalance, to offset emissions in getting to net zero. So some pathways between now and the point of net zero will involve more gross emissions, counterbalanced by more removals, others less of both. Next slide. But some pathways get us quite quickly down to net zero and to stay within the remaining carbon budget. Others substantially exceed it, take temperatures above 1.5 degrees and create a period of overshoot. And in those pathways, we rely on carbon dioxide removal in the second half of the century. We rely on it to take back this excess warming that we have added to the atmosphere, this excess carbon dioxide that causes this excess warming from the atmosphere. So different uses of carbon dioxide removal. And the view of myself and my colleagues, this differential dependence on carbon dioxide removal provides a scientific and legal hook with which we can scrutinize different pathways consistent with the long-term temperature goal and understand those that are in fact consistent with norms and principles of international law from those that are not, and use this as a basis for clarifying state obligations. Next slide. So what is the difference between these different pathways? Well, we see that pathways that entail greater overshoot of 1.5 degrees have a wide range of risks associated with them. Risks caused by the period of time in which we exceed 1.5 degrees, creating a world of greater climate change impacts. We know that with every incremental increase in temperature, we see worse health impacts. We see greater temperature-related mortality. We see increased spread of vector-borne diseases. We also know that the risk of exceeding tipping points rises also above 1.5 degrees. The longer the duration of overshoot and the higher the level of peak warming, the risks of hitting certain Earth system tipping points increase also. Some of these climate change impacts are notionally reversible if we get back down to 1.5 degrees. Others are not. Species rendered extinct will be extinct forever. Next slide, please. And this future of overshoot is a future that we are rapidly approaching. State climate targets put us on track to substantially overshoot 1.5 degrees. Either they're not consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement at all, or they only are after a period of overshoots, given that they put us on track to produce many more emissions than would be consistent with keeping temperatures always to this 1.5 degree limit. Next slide. Next slide, please. There are also other risks associated with dependence on removals. We know, for instance, that developing carbon dioxide removal at the scale required in most of these model scenarios would involve ramping up substantially not only natural sinks that we understand, but also developing new technologies that don't yet exist at scale. So the risk they won't be deployed. And there's also a risk that carbon removed from the atmosphere, especially by natural sinks, will not be removed permanently, but will go back out into the atmosphere. The consequence, more warming than we expect to have. So, a second source of risk. And finally, we've got a range of social, next slide, a range of social, environmental, and economic impacts depending heavily on removals, including the large amounts of land use required to do this. Next slide, please. And despite the fact that this dependence removals are central to the way in which climate targets are being developed, central to the modeling underpinning the way climate change is managed as a global issue, there still remains relatively little scrutiny. Many states disclose in only a limited way their dependence removals to meet their climate targets. There's also substantial uncertainty. We see, for instance, accounting choices making a substantial effect. To use one particular example, given it's currently topical, in the case of Finland, Finland had long reported a substantial carbon sink from land use, which under recently revised metrics, in fact, is now a net source as of the last few years. That's just one example that gives an illustration of some of the uncertainty and transparency issues associated with carbon removals. But this is a problem now, because as you saw in those figures before, the choice about how much we depend on carbon removal in the long term, that choice affects exactly how we need to cut our emissions in the next 5 to 10 years or so. And the choice of how we cut our emissions in the next 5 to 10 years affects how much we'll depend on removals in the long term. Next slide. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this in the context of health is because, in our view, one of the key hooks that we have, one of the key reasons why we can scrutinize these different pathways is our understanding of the differential health impacts at different levels of warming. And what we see is that those pathways that involve higher peak warming and longer periods of overshoot have substantially higher health impacts. And the work that my legal colleagues and I are doing is trying to understand how these differential health impacts allow us to narrow that range of pathways and clarify, therefore, state obligations. What is clear is that exceeding 1.5 degrees means greatly increased exposure to a wide range of health impacts. Andy's covered many of those, I won't dwell on it. You can actually skip the next 2 slides for that reason also. This final slide was also just to make a point I made earlier that recent research has also shown for higher peak warming, for a longer period of overshoot, various different Earth system tipping points may also be met, and the consequences would be substantially greater climate change impacts. Climate change impacts, of course, are devastating and likely inconsistent with human rights obligations of states at lower levels of warming without tipping points. But exceeding 1.5 degrees increases the risk that we'll reach those tipping points. Next slide. And so our view, putting together these various different strands of evidence, is that dependence on CDR disclosed by states insofar as they do so is likely inconsistent with norms and principles of international law. We know that high overshoot pathways involve potentially extreme breaches of human rights obligations and therefore are inconsistent with human rights approaches to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. We've heard already today that a high standard of due diligence is required under international law in the context of transboundary harm. What that means is we need urgent, low-risk approaches to stabilizing temperatures, and that means not following pathways that involve substantial overshoots of 1.5 degrees. And what we can do with information about the attributed and projected impacts of climate change on health is better understand the differential impacts of different pathways and therefore clarify what states really do need to be doing. Next slide, please. And if courts can uphold rule, or if courts do uphold our contention that pathways that involve greater overshoot and high dependence on removals are indeed inconsistent with norms and principles of international law, then the consequences could be substantial. States and potentially even corporations may need to accelerate their mitigation action, especially in the near term. What does that mean? Well, currently corporates and states assess financial risks associated with climate change on the basis of planned decarbonization transition pathways. Those transition pathway assessments and the climate-related financial risk assessments associated with them would be rendered inaccurate in a world in which we need to rapidly ramp up mitigation action. So the implications of this sort of health research can travel through a whole range of different pathways, understanding the impacts of climate change, clarifying state obligations, accelerating mitigation obligations of various states. And ultimately, the point I want to leave you with, and especially in the context of an interdisciplinary institute like this one, good quality scientifically informed legal research is really the foundation of understanding state obligations in the context of climate change. With this sort of work, we can cut through the uncertainty of having different scenarios, different choices we can make, clarify the obligations that states and corporations have, and use that to inform risk assessments we do in financial contexts, state obligations to mitigate, and then when they continue to fall short, to inform litigators as well. With that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.